Hello and welcome to the Grid Podcast, your insight into all things grid and how it's helping us achieve net zero. Today in the show, Brian and I are going to be taking a short break from our transmission capacity crunch mini-series because from the start of April 2023, the world of grid connections across Great Britain has massively changed through what is known as either the SCR, the Significant Code Review, or the Connections Charging Reform. So what's the headlines on these changes, Brian?
Yeah, so the headline change here with the SCR, as if we're an industry that are short in acronyms, Significant Code Review, is really that demand connections no longer pay for reinforcement costs. So that's really any EV development, industrial projects, on housing development, which all sounds brilliant. And alongside that, then we have a lot of regulation in around flexible and curtailable connections, which probably more focused at the generation kind of battery storage market, but should also bring benefits, I think, into some EV charging and some, in particular, industrial developments as well. But obviously the big one, reinforcement costs being basically paid for by the DNOs, sounds like a huge silver bullet to those industries. But is it really? So we have the detail in this now. We covered this probably back about a year ago when we had the big high level announcement by Ofgem. At the time, and everybody was pretty excited. This looked like a real silver bullet, but obviously we have the detail now. We've had eyes on effectively the legal texts around how this is all going to work, and as always, the devil is in the detail. So we're really going to try and cut through the hype around SCR and connection charging reform on the podcast. Cut through a lot of the kind of myths. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. Even the DNOs are still getting up to speed with this. A lot of industry kind of misinformation. I've heard all sorts of different rumours about it.
Free connections.
Yeah, that just aren't true, and things being excluded that aren't excluded and all this sort of thing. So we're really delving into the detail to work out, well, is it the silver bullet or is it a bit of a damp squib?
Yep.
Or, as usual, the truth normally lies somewhere in
the middle of that.
Somewhere in between. So basically, rather than everyone sitting at home over their weekends trying to read through all 1,178 pages of DCUSA and various other legal and regulatory texts, you can spend the next 20 to 30 minutes with us listening to some delightful Northern Irish accents, try to give you a quick high-level summary in the whole thing.
Perfect.
And the key thing, probably before we go any further here, is in the new world, really, the new world is here to stay. So we're in a landscape now where the grid's getting more congested and more strained than ever before, alongside having, the SCR is one example of a more complex regulation coming in, not just for the DNOs. A lot of this regulation also applies to customers and developers who are looking to connect to the grid. So there is an evolving and ever more increasingly complex regulatory landscape to kind of navigate here as well.
And even the flexible connections and that and all is it's trying to bring, where there's scarce capacity or whatever, optioneering, so it does get more complicated, but it's good to see these things being brought in to allow things to move forward. Yeah,
it brings complexities, but it opens up solutions to people. And it's really with this in mind, then, that's kind of, we're trying to put that at the heart of this podcast, is being able to know if you're outside of the grid, knowing a bit more about how you interface with it or get the best out of it is really more important than ever, and knowing how to navigate this new world.
Okay, so what are we going to cover today then, sort of high level, and then we'll get into the detail?
Yeah, so I thought a kind of a neat way to break this down is cover a bit about what has changed and who has it changed for. So, this largely impacts on demand customers, particularly around the reinforcement charging reform. So housing developers, EV charging developers, industrial, large commercial developers, battery centres, that type of thing. When I do say demand connections, when I refer to demand connections in this podcast going forward, it does exclude battery storage. Battery storage were kind of excluded through it's a technicality around being classed as non-final demand. So battery storage are lumped in with the renewable generators who really haven't got a whole lot out of this. So yeah, the big ticket items there is obviously the reinforcement cost subsidy, or whatever you want to call it, for demand connections. And then, but there is a lot of exceptions and issues with it that we will touch on. And then there's some more probably kind of minor changes for renewable projects and battery projects. We did think the regulation around flexible connections was going to be a real game changer for a lot of renewable projects. But to be honest, my personal opinion is that bit of it's a total dump squib, really. Effectively renewable and battery developers have bigger issues in terms of the transmission capacity crunch that we're covering on the separate mini-series.
Yep.
So this podcast probably will focus more on demand connections, sort of EV, industrial housing, and we'll touch probably more in on the flexible connection piece in a separate podcast. I think it's a slightly different thing on its own.
So that's kind of like how or what has changed and who has changed for. So how has it changed and what are the sort of key issues?
Yeah, so that'll be the next topic we'll come to, is basically how has it changed and what are the challenges or issues here. And there are quite a few of them to be aware of. So the devil has really been in the detail of this. I don't want to come across like a hypocrite as well, because you probably could scroll back and listen to one of our podcasts from a year ago. I haven't listened to it back. We were probably all positive pushing this. So I'm just saying we have seen more detail now. You know, it did all sound great in theory at the time. Very high level announcement by Ofgem, even though their high level announcement ran to like 100 odd pages. But the sort of the legal text, if you like, is now out, and there is some challenges in there. So in terms of key things and how it's changed that we'll run through. So obviously the reinforcement cost, that's the big one, but the probably the bigger unknown one is all the exceptions to that, and challenges around that. Voltage rules as well kind of apply in there, probably less important. Speculative developments are now regulated for, and that's going to be a big thing. It appears to be really onerous towards housing development. So that's going to be a big one, I think, for any housing developers going forward, that whole speculative development.
And that's in there kind of just to ensure that the capacity is used. That's kind of...
Yeah, it's part of realising that part around the grid being more constrained than ever. It's a bit of a realisation and trying to police the access to the capacity, that it isn't being kind of taken up by funding projects or whatever. Phase capacity sites is now a regulated thing, so that there's a legal definition and whatnot in for phase capacity sites, and it kind of ties in with speculative developments. So there's a big push now to push people to be more upfront and honest with a phase capacity plan, rather than saying you need 10 megawatts tomorrow, when in reality it's going to take you 5 or 6 years to build out, and that 5 or 6 years gives the grid time to catch up. So we'll touch in on that. It's something you need to be more aware of, and we'll come back to that at the end as well. And then timescales that's probably the biggest challenge, I think, around all this. So we're going to see more projects that are commercially viable by having the reinforcement subsidized or funded or whatever you want to call it, which means they're going to trigger more reinforcement. More projects will trigger reinforcement, and it means then your project is more likely to get caught up in a reinforcement scheme, and with that comes timescales. So that means there's a much greater risk of losing control of timescales for energization, and without sight of risks or any control or clear mitigation strategies for those risks as well. And as we know, both time delays and uncertainty kills business plans. Yep. So that we're already seeing that. You know, we've been looking at grid capacity and sites probably since the start of this year through this new lens, and I probably didn't appreciate myself just how much some of the timescale and uncertainty is such a killer to various types of development. So that's a big issue, and we'll touch back on that. Basically, our final kind of point then, or wrap up, is going to be what our recommendations would be to a developer, whether it's EV charging, industrial, whether it's housing sites. Our take on, well, what can you do about it? What's some key high-level principles to try and navigate the new world then? So that, I think, sets the agenda.
Sets it well. Plenty to cover. Also very positive, though, that, we're starting to see things like those phased plans, becoming actually a real thing. That's really what happens. On sites, very rarely do you go straight in and everybody needs the demand straight away. So I think that's positive to see those all being integrated and just kind of bringing us up to speed and having a set of rules, I suppose, in some ways will allow us to manage to that, but it's making sure we know those risks and manage them as we go. So yeah, let's get into the detail. So those sort of key changes, sort of for demand developments for EV charging, housing, etc. What's the main areas that we want to cover?
Yeah, so focusing in there, so grid reinforcement costs, as we say, that is the big ticket item in all of this, albeit there's various other topics that have been weaved into the regulatory and code changes at the same time. And well, the big one is, we've been talking to so many developers in different areas who just think, yep, like projects were unfeasible before, or new projects going forward, and it's all going to be super cheap grid connections. But that isn't really the case. It's not that straightforward. So the big main exception, as I see it, is the minimum scheme rule, which has always been there. It's a historic rule. It's back in the new codes. And effectively, it means that the DNO's obligation is to offer you the connection scheme that is the lowest overall cost. That is not the lowest overall cost to you as the connecting customer. That is the lowest overall cost, full stop.
For the scheme.
Doesn't
matter who pays.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So probably the best thing is to try and do an example of this. So where you might have, say, a 1 MVA, whether it might be a housing site or an EV charging hub, and it's on the outskirts of a town, and let's say it's 5 kilometers up the road to the primary substation, but there's 11 kV overhead network runs through the site. Your natural kind of inclination in the new world would be to say, well, yeah, the overhead lines maybe at capacity or close to it, but I'll connect on there, and the DNO is going to pay to upgrade that line the whole way back to the substation. And sure, that's brilliant. It's going to cost me nothing.
Yep.
But the DNO might look at that and say, well, hold on, what is the lowest overall scheme here? Is it cheaper to run just a brand new cable back to the primary substation? And if the answer is yes, then they will say, right, the cable connection is the better one to go for, but the customer would pay for that full cable connection. So the difference in price there between the connection for the client could be, I'm picking figures out there, this won't be right at all, but it could cost the customer £3 million versus costing them 200 grand or something.
Yep.
That's where so the minimum scheme rule, that's the kind of cost differences it can create here. Yeah. Which is huge.
So minimum scheme is going to be a thing, isn't it? It's going to be controversial, or test it, or have we got the minimum scheme here overall?
Exactly. That it's going to lead to those discussions, which is quite difficult for customers though, because a lot of the time, well, they have no idea what the other options would have been. So how do they test the minimum scheme? And that's something we'll come back to later. So that really is something that's going to cause a bit of confusion. People are going to be getting connection offers out with huge costs, and they're going to be thinking, hold on a minute, I thought those costs were all gone now, and it'll be down to the minimum scheme rule. In most instances, I think this is going to be the biggest driver. And if you think about it as well, the DNOs are under huge pressure. They have short timelines to quote these things. Yourself, it's much more easier to go onto Google Maps and plot a cable route up the road, rather than trying to work out a whole overhead line, reinforcement scheme. So just in terms of pure ease of getting connection offers out the door, it's much easier just to say, yep, there's a line on a map from A to B, brand new cable, and you pay for it, rather than having to price up this whole higgledy-piggledy overhead line.
And then like understanding resupply options and all those various things that become even trickier when you're trying to do those sort of studies.
Exactly. So we have seen it, where it is just the handiest option gets issued out, and it's really only once you pick into it and dig into the detail you find, well, hold on, actually, the minimum scheme could be the overhead, and that would cost us nothing. But it does trigger then a timescale issue. So again, we've seen these examples where you get the DNO offer, it'll be cable down the road, and you're like, well, hold on, the minimum scheme would be that reinforcement. So in the new world, that reinforcement will be free, which is all good, but you lose control of timescale then.
Yeah.
How long is it going to take for the DNO to get that reinforcement scheme designed? Is there extra third-party consents? They might have new stay wires, they might have bigger poles, they might need single poles turned into H poles. So there's third-party consents then come into play. Is there any plan? Normally there's not a planning implication, but there could be. It's a risk. So all of a sudden, your £3 million connection might only be costing you 200 grand, but you don't have a lot of certainty in when you're getting it.
Yep. And it is hard even to compare those schemes too. Like the cable costs up a road is easier compared to then a rebuild of a overhead line, whereas you say there's so many different factors around conductor size, stays, pole heights,
tensions between
the
poles, angles in the line, all impacts on that. So the other point I was just going to make then is, well, you could have options there. You could have a 3 million quid option that you could go and contract with an ICP and get some contractual certainty on it, and it's going to be delivered within X months. Or you could have a 200 grand option that you don't really know. It might take a year, it might take 2 or whatever.
Yeah.
And different options suit different business models better. So this is the whole thing now. The regulations bring a lot more options into play, but different options, certainly I've learned a lot in the last 6 to 12 months, different options suit different business plans massively.
Yep.
Some developers can and some certain types of development can live with longer timescales and bigger risks around those if they know it's going to be cheaper. And some developers, time and uncertainty just kills their business plan, kills the development.
Yep.
So that's the biggest one, I think.
Yeah. And then is this like this reinforcement cost thing, like are the DNOs are ultimately the paying customers on the hook for any cost? Like, can it just be multi-million pounds, or what's the crack with that?
Yeah, so that's the next kind of big exception to come in. So if you ask anybody what the big exception is, they would probably tell you the high cost cap before they would tell you the minimum scheme. So that the high cost cap is one of the other main exceptions, but I don't really see this being a big issue. Ofgem made a big fuss over it. A lot of people in the kind of industry you hear talking sort of are very aware of it. I don't expect the high cost cap to come in as too much of an issue. So to explain what the high cost cap is, it's basically a bit of a ceiling that Ofgem's put in to just make sure people aren't triggering massive reinforcement costs that, as bill payers, we all have to pay for. So it's set at 1,720 quid per kVA of capacity that the customer's applying for. So if you think about this, there's actually a bit of an odd thing here. This might impact on very small connections, like a 70 kVA EV charger. They may well get hung up with a high cost cap. Yep. But if you take the typical 1 MVA connection, with a high cost cap, you've got about a £1.7 million budget of reinforcement before your connection cost. Before you're liable. So basically the high cost cap is you take your connection capacity, multiply it by 1,720 quid. That gives you your kind of reinforcement pot that the DNO is allowed to spend. And then anything above that, you have to pay for yourself.
And it is just the difference you pay for?
It's anything above and beyond the top, but you pay it in full. There's no apportionment in that. But if you take a 1 MVA, say it's a charging hub or a housing site development, £1.7 million of a reinforcement pot is pretty hefty. If you're getting into that sort of reinforcement or larger, you're probably into like, I don't know, bulk supply point or something, in which case the timescales is going to be a bigger issue and probably kill your project anyway.
And commercially they mightn't been acceptable beyond that anyway, if in the old world.
Yeah, so 1.7 million, that'll do you a good bit of reinforcement. The one issue or where it might, well, basically say your trigger and bulk supply point kind of 132 kV reinforcement. Well, actually, sorry, that wouldn't actually count because there is a voltage rule on this as well. Yeah. So the high cost cap's only factored into the voltage reinforcement on the voltage you're connecting to and the voltage above. Yep. So if you are 1 MVA EV charging hub or housing development, you're more than likely connecting to the 11 kV network. You'll get a lot of 11 kV, and if 1 MVA is unlikely to be the triggering factor on 33 kV, I think. Yep. Maybe if it's a 132 kV to 11 kV substation you're fed out of, that's maybe when you have more issues. But the other factor I see is, well, if you're triggering that type of reinforcement, you're going to be opening up a load more capacity than 1 MVA. So you're either going to bump your capacity up to 3 or 4 MVA, in which case your high cost cap then changes to 6 or 7 million. Or you're gonna look around the area. You're either going to develop something else in that area, or you're going to you're going to be able to pinpoint somebody else that's a large energy user and let them trigger the reinforcement. Yep. So the high cost cap might create some complexity, but I don't see any complexity there that most people wouldn't be able to work around. But again, it kind of comes back to that being aware of the options and kind of
I think it is like the exception, isn't it? Rather than the real, that it was meant to be triggered at a point where there's only so many percent, wasn't it? That would be above the high cost cap.
I think basically Ofgem tried to set it that it was the 95th percentile, that only 5% of development should get affected by it.
Yeah.
Which in itself kind of backs up my theory that the minimum schemes probably, I think it's going to be a more common occurrence than that.
Yeah, I mean, my only slight concern in that one was that I think it was on a per scheme basis that went ahead. So there's probably ones, within the 95% mark that didn't go ahead because they weren't commercially viable. But like I think ultimately it's still going to affect a small number of projects. So it's not as, I think the minimum scheme is definitely going to be more critical. In terms of like other exceptions, then there's lots of other bits and pieces. Could we maybe sort of fly through those?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and skim through these, as some of them get a bit techy, and it's more for kind of people like ourselves to be considering these things in a bit more detail when we're optioneering grid connections, rather than sort of boring people on a podcast with it. But I will skim through because it does demonstrate just that, we've highlighted minimum scheme, high cost cap. There's quite a few other exceptions that will just chip away at certain projects. So we have talked about reinforcement above the high cost cap not being apportioned, so that's fine. And we've discussed the voltage rules and the high cost cap as well. Just on the voltage rules, generation is different then. So it's 1 voltage. Reinforcement at the voltage you're connecting to isn't funded for generation. It's 1 voltage up and above, but there's a much lower high cost cap on that. It's only £200 a kVA. So that's where I think the reinforcement stuff, it's small change really for a large generation project. And most big generation projects now connect at 132 kV anyway. And it's worth noting, none of this applies to transmission. Yeah. So the transmission charging, and we'll cover in our transmission capacity crunch mini series, is a whole different Ofgem basically decided, that's too hard, we're going to ignore that in this whole code review. They had it in and then they took it out. But yeah, other exceptions to the having your reinforcement paid for by the DNO. If the reinforcement's above and beyond the minimum scheme, then you have to pay the difference. Now, you might think, well, why would I do that? Well, as I say, losing control of timescale here is going to be a huge factor for so many people. So there's a few obvious examples I can think of where you might want to pay to speed things up. So, a classic example is overhead line versus underground cable, where a DNO says the minimum scheme is going to be a new overhead line. It requires third-party consents and planning permission, which, you basically have no control over. Huge risk in terms of timescale. You have no idea when you're going to get connected, really, if that's the case. Whereas you might want to say, well, hold on, let's run a cable up the road, and we know we can get that done in 9 months or whatever it is. Yeah. So you may well want to pay the difference there to make that happen. And again, this will get complicated because you're into options within options, and all different customers will have different views on this depending on what their business plan looks like. So without getting tied up, I'll move on. Downstream reinforcement's excluded, so I'll not spend time on that, but it's a bit of a weird one. Some fault level issues, that type of thing. It's going to be fairly rare. I don't see it being common, but again, it's just another one that might chip away at a couple of projects. Exclusions around temporary connections is worth noting. So if you are doing any kind of building supplies, temporary connections, they're excluded from the whole thing. We have seen 5 MVA, 10 MVA temporary connections for very large building projects. Yeah. So it's just worth noting that you won't get your reinforcement paid for there. There's some detail around that in terms of time scale, what is a temporary connection, etc. I think it's around 5 years. There's like a 5-year threshold. There can also be exceptions where switchgear upgrades result in increase in fault level capacity, but not thermal capacity. This one is a bit techy, and I think it actually could become a bit of an issue if you're triggering primary box supply point upgrades. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So we will just monitor that one. And as I say, we'll probably come back and do another podcast in a few months' time on this.
Be interesting to see where that one goes, because I think we did do a podcast on fault level, and at one stage we thought there may be ultimately a queue for fault level and fault level headroom. So I'm kind of taking they've taken that out as an exception at the minute because the fault level headroom's not a big thing.
So if you're triggering it based on fault level capacity reasons, it's different. Yeah. But it's more if you're upgrading fault level capacity, but for different reasons.
Okay.
So it's going to be a weird one, and it'll be interesting to see how it gets applied. And then another potentially common enough exception as well is where you're connected across two circuits, or I think the legal terminology is between two different points in the distribution network, which you could kind of argue any demand connection kind of does that. But anyway, you'll have to pay the full reinforcement costs on the lowest cost feeder under that scenario. So again, I don't want to get bogged down in detail. At a guesstimate, I'd maybe say we see 5 to 10% of EV charging hubs kind of connect across two feeders. So it's just another small one that's just sort of chipping away at certain projects, really. And yeah, you'd see that applying to housing sites and things as well.
Yep, and then it's on those bigger connections, isn't it? Sort of 1 MVA up, where you will have multiple feeders and resupply.
Where you're more likely to, if you're in that kind of 1 to 2, 1 to 3 MVA kind of range, that's sort of where you're more likely to maybe be in and around that, or larger. So yeah, those are high level without, sitting here and reading the full legal script.
That would be a long podcast.
Yeah, all 1,200 pages of it.
So we're basically saying, like, don't assume that all connections are now going to be really cheap and you're going to get them really quickly, and that your reinforcement will all be paid by the DNO, because as we've covered, there's a number of exceptions, number of things to consider, and there's a lot more options in the table.
I think that's about it. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what percentage of connections are going to fall foul of the exceptions. I think it could realistically be about 50% of connections with capacity issues that kind of, have to navigate some sort of a awkward sort of ride through it, if you like. But it's going to be interesting how it plays out, because obviously the DNOs are only getting to grips with this. There's loads of misunderstanding out there about it.
And everybody have their own play of interpretation of these, which is going to be an interesting view as well.
As with anything, once you put it into a legal text, you get any number of different interpretations on how it actually applies as well. So that will be interesting. Another interesting one on the minimum scheme thing as well is where, the DNO does just propose new cable up the road that you have to pay for. It's kind of, well, how does that align with their obligations to develop an efficient, coordinated network, as well as their kind of wider environmental obligations to minimize their environmental footprint as well?
Yeah.
Where, potentially upgrading an existing asset would sort of tick those boxes a little bit more as well.
I know, because the old 11 kV planner in me, was thinking, if there's two customers there, you could design a better scheme.
Yeah.
So that, I think those two things will kind of jar a little, just in terms of conflict from an engineering perspective.
There's definitely tension there, I think.
So the next challenge you noted was speculative connections, and we had said particularly that might be onerous in housing developments, and it might put them at a disadvantage, compared to large industrial and commercial or EV. So how do we explain that? What's this speculative connections piece, and how do we consider it?
Yeah, so the first thing to note is really speculative connection is another exclusion then from having your reinforcement costs paid for. And speculative connections were actually in the old regs around cost apportionment and having connection costs shared. But it was never really defined. So it is now down in kind of the legal text, if you like, around what is a speculative connection or how we define it. And it's effectively a point scoring system. So there's different criteria that you will either get positive, neutral, or negative points on different criteria. It all gets tallied up, and what your final score is tells you if you're a speculative connection or not. And again, we won't have time to go into the full detail on this because it really is a dry read. But just to give some very high level, some of the key factors or a flavour for them in a way, high level summary. And just before I do, it'll become evident as I go through them why this is more aimed at housing developers, or why it appears to be. So there's lots of emphasis. Several of the criteria are around providing sort of clear project programs or phase plans to include sort of realistic phased capacity ramp up based on different criteria and things. But this now appears to be key. So this is sort of coming back to the whole phase capacity thing, having phase plans and the time scale of those plans as well is also important in terms of your point scoring. So again, we'll not get into the full detail of the points and things, but that's a very important thing to note. And that's something pretty much everybody, EV, industrial, housing development, we're going to need to really get on top of those phase plans as part of a connection application process. So that's one key kind of takeaway, big change. Large housing developments are penalised. If you're over 5,000 dwellings, you're looked on negatively. Financial commitments on larger grid assets are looked on positively. So, again, this is mainly targeted at housing connections. I can't think of too many EV or industrial type scenarios that would apply. But if you're doing phase one of a 4-phase housing development, that if you're installing the large primary substation or whatever it is you need for phase one, that serves the whole development, then you score better points. But if you're just installing whatever the cheapest minimum thing is to get phase one away that will not cater for phases 2, 3, 4, that's looked on negatively.
You might have it maybe it just depends what way the application processes work for you. Maybe have it on a large retail park or business park. Maybe might be the other place that it could potentially just depend how you go about that.
Yeah, some industrial applications, it definitely will. These things all will definitely apply to all their demand users. Yeah. It just does.
It always nearly fits in the housing one.
It all appears to me that it's been written for housing development. Yeah. And there's a thing around future provision to do with if you're connecting 75% or more of your total housing development in the first phase, that's looked on favourably. I'm assuming that doesn't often happen in large housing developments either. And then obviously there's other things around being looked on favourably there if things don't go well. And there's normally a neutral band in these as well, in between. And then planning permission is obviously another big one. So planning permission is in. If you have planning, that's good. If you don't have planning, that's not good. And there's stuff around outline planning and being in local development plans and all that type of thing as well. But basically, most new developments probably don't have planning, no matter what sector you're in. That's going to get you negative points. So really, for any development now, you need to be aware of how to score some positive points and score enough of them to outweigh the negative of not having planning. Otherwise, you might have some issues with your reinforcement cost not being funded.
Yep.
So this is actually quite key. We certainly are embedding this in all our processes with our clients. But as I say, I don't think it's going to hurt industrial or EV or renewable developers or anything too much. But housing in particular looks to be quite heavily penalised on this. Penalised, maybe the wrong word, I don't know. But I do know I've been chatting to our sister company TriConnect, who obviously work in the housing sector, and they've been doing a lot of work to basically embed this into what they do day and daily to keep basically developers right in that area.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's in everyone's interest to de-risk and make sure developments actually do happen. So that's what we're all here to try and do and what we're about. But it does just create an additional regulation headache for people seeking grid connection.
And ultimately that's why the regulations have been brought in as well, to ensure that those grid capacities are available for people who are not speculative.
That's exactly it. It's kind of there in recognition of the point I said earlier about there's going to be more viable projects, trigger more reinforcement, and we're already seeing it in a way. Yep. The grid is getting more strained, so it's just trying to police that kind of capacity that little bit better.
And it's not dissimilar to the transmission stuff we talked about before, about the queue for transmission capacity, whether it's was it all rail cars in the road, or just some of those are speculative. So I think the rules here to solve the distribution demand issues are good in terms of trying to do that, but you have to be aware how it might impact you for your own individual project and what you do.
Exactly. You just need to navigate it really, and just again, most developers playing this fairly will be fine. It's just knowing you need to submit the right evidence at a certain time and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But to compare to transmission though, we were probably saying in the transmission miniseries, it's the lack of this stuff that has led to massive issues.
Yeah.
Where you can go out without any sort of LOA and book up 5 gigawatt of capacity of transmission. But yet, I can see how a housing developer might sit here thinking that's a bit unfair.
Yeah.
I have all this paperwork to do, but the person with a 5 gigawatt battery thing
and I've built thousands of houses over the last year and always connected them, so.
Yeah, exactly. So look, not for us to comment on, I suppose, but anyway.
Okay, so look, to summarise then, it isn't really straightforward at all. The sort of initial headlines was free connections, not so sure about that. So what's our key takeaways for anyone that's sort of seeking those demand connections?
Yeah, so to summarise my kind of key advice, or certainly what we've started, getting the thinking in our team anyway, is navigating minimum scheme and timescale challenges, I think, is going to be the two biggest things for most people developing pretty much anything. And that's really down to understanding the local network, understanding the options that might be there, and understanding the associated time and cost, sort of, well, the quantum of them and the risks around both timescale and cost for the different options. And you need to kind of have that understanding before you can really start to think, well, what is the minimum scheme? What are the different minimums? There might be a couple of options of minimum scheme that are close enough together that you might have one over the other. But what one would you rather have? Would you rather have cheaper but faster, or cheaper and more certainty, or would you rather have, well, I can bear with, I'll have to live with timescale. So there's a lot of that, testing what the cheapest option is, testing the different risk scenarios that fit with your business plan the best. Would you rather have that 200 grand connection but waiting, an uncertain period of time for the DNO to operate some overhead line, or would you just rather pay 2 million quid and get it done in 6 months?
There's no one size fits all here.
That is the exact thing, and we are finding that, having a lot of discussions with different developers from different avenues. Even two developers in the same sector will have different parameters in terms of how their investment case is built, their business plans, and everything else. And even just on different sites, there might be different obligations or different timescale needs at certain sites. And then the other thing really is understanding if there's other sort of more compromised options that might be available to you then as well. So, would a phase capacity plan work for you, and would it work for the grid? What does the phase capacity plan that works for the grid look like, so that you can actually take a bit of a view on that? Would a curtailable connection work, either on a temporary or enduring basis? What would that curtailment impact look like for you that meets the grid's needs? And how would that impact you? And could you live with it? Those are the sort of things you need to consider and step through. And then the other one really is, the other key takeaway is that bit around speculative development. You really need to be looking at that, building that into your kind of project development process, and making sure you're on top of both that and, well, connection milestones set outside these regs, but they've been in connection offers for a long time. They're finding their way into more lower capacity demand connections now as well. So both speculative and the milestone thing needs to be, you need to be aware of that. That's a key risk to your development.
Yeah. And the milestone thing is sort of a further backup of, ensuring that capacity is being used, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So I suppose to summarize, this new world creates a lot more options. Options create opportunities, but they create headaches, and they create complexity. But there is a lot of opportunity in it as well. I hope we haven't been overly negative here. That this is a great thing. Yep. Reinforcement will be paid for on a lot of different projects. There's just a lot more kind of option here, and you need to think about or tailoring both your cost and time scale needs.
Yeah, and not just that wee bit more upfront planning and consideration with the grid at that point in time, I think makes a huge difference to what your project looks like down the road, doesn't it? So yeah, great to see these now in. It'll be interesting to see how they pan out over the next number of months. So in terms of the podcast, that's us for another session. We are going to go back to our transmission capacity crunch mini-series in the next episode, but we do plan to sort of check in on the SCR and the new connections world in the next few months. How DNOs have adjusted to it, how customers have adjusted to it, how we have adjusted to it. And once we get a bit more exposure on the regs and interpretation. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out, whether, as we've anticipated in this podcast, there are things to discuss or we need to delete this one off our podcast list because we've got it completely wrong. But yeah, we think there's loads here to consider, and it will be good to come back round and also to get, you, the listener's view on what you've experienced to date. Any queries you might have around some of that stuff, please do get in contact. So thanks for listening or watching the Grid podcast. Please do subscribe on YouTube or wherever you normally get your podcasts. You can ask questions there in the YouTube comments, and we'll reply or drop us a line at thegrid@esparknetworks.co.uk. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, and podcast highlights will be loaded there. We'll speak to you shortly again. Thank you.